It looks like a tomb, but it reads like a riddle, carved 500 years ago in bronze and stone. In Westminster Abbey stands the grave of Lady Margaret Beaufort, a woman who changed the course of English history and who might be called the Tudor Kingmaker. Her memorial was more than just a way for her nearest and dearest to remember her by, though. It's a message from the Tudor dynasty to the world, and in this episode of History Calling, I'm going to unravel it for you. I'll decode the carefully selected symbols of power, faith, and legacy that adorn Margaret's final resting place, from shields to emblems to a strange mythical creature few can name, and an inscription written by none other than famed scholar Desiderius Erasmus. In so doing, I'll reveal the final chapter in this remarkable woman's story. Before we get going, hi, if you're new here, welcome to History Calling, where I provide videos every week looking at all aspects of the past, but with a particular focus on royalty and the use of original sources. If that sounds like your kind of thing, please do consider giving the video a thumbs up, clicking the subscribe button, it's entirely free, and switching on the notification bell so that you get a little ding every time I upload. You can also get more from me by becoming a YouTube member or by joining me on patreon.com/historycalling, where I release bonus material every week, including early access to ad-free videos and extra podcasts. You can join my free mailing list too, available on my website, historycallingofficial.com, and get 2 complimentary downloads right away. All the links are below for you. Lady Margaret Beaufort, Countess of Richmond and Derby, and mother of Henry VII, died at Gates, which was the house of the Abbot of Westminster Abbey, on the 29th of June, 1509, just a matter of weeks after her only child had passed away too. She was 66 years old and expired days after attending the coronation of her grandson, Henry VIII, and his new wife, Catherine of Aragon. The strain of the festivities, and possibly the consumption of a cygnet, that's a baby swan, are sometimes blamed for her rapid demise. She had led an extraordinary life that included being a 12-year-old bride and a 13-year-old mother, and surviving the Wars of the Roses, and you can hear all about it in the 2 episodes I have which go through her biography, and which I'll leave linked for you. Today, though, let's stay focused on her burial in Westminster Abbey, where she was interred in the chapel built by her son on the 9th of July, and where he had also been laid to rest after his death in April. She is not with him in his tomb in the centre aisle, however, where he lies alongside his wife, Elizabeth of York, died 1503, and their descendant, James I, died 1625. Instead, Margaret's remains are in the south aisle, separated from view by pews, though it is still only a matter of feet away from her boy. The funeral sermon, made a month after her death by her confessor, Bishop John Fisher, included the line, "Everyone that knew her loved her, and everything that she said or did became her." Fisher, by the way, was later executed in 1535 by Henry VIII for refusing to accept the king as the head of the church in England. In her will, written in 1508, Margaret asked that her executors, "As soon as they conveniently may after our decease, do make or cause to be made in the chapel there, as our body shall be interred, a convenient tomb by their discretions, and 1 altar or 2 in the same chapel, for the said 2 chantry masses there perpetually to be said, at the hours and times, and with all such prayers and observances as is afore rehearsed." The chantry masses have long since ceased, but her last wishes for a suitable tomb were very well met, and work began on a monument to her soon after her death, which still stands over her final resting place to this day. The Italian sculptor Pietro Torrigiano was engaged to create a memorial for the woman who had become known as My Lady the King's Mother. The original contract for the monument still survives and has long since been published. However, it's very long and written in early 16th century English, which can be a bit of a chore to follow. So I'm primarily going to summarise it here with just a few little quotes sprinkled in for good measure. It was dated the 23rd of November 1511 and made between the executors of Margaret's will and Torrigiano, referred to as Peter Thorison of Florence in the document. Torrigiano agreed to make at his own cost, quote, a tabernacle of copper with an image lying in the same tabernacle and a beast called a yas lying at the foot of the said tabernacle, with like pillars, bases, chaptrels, gablets, crockets, annals, finials, orbs, housing, scutcheons, meaning escutcheons, graven with portcullises and roses, all of copper and in like making length and breadth according to a patron, meaning pattern, drawn in a cloth. Torrigiano also undertook to gild the image, meaning the effigy, of Margaret and all other decorations on the tomb which required such gilding. Now, a quick note before we move on. The beast called a yas is actually the mythical animal known as a eel, which few people have heard of, I suspect. I think the error here can perhaps be accounted for because whoever transcribed this document originally mistook the letter L for the long S so favoured in handwriting of the 16th century. If you see my episode all about old handwriting, you can learn more about that. Also, although copper was apparently the metal of choice for the effigy, in fact, the final product is made of gilded bronze. Torrigiano further undertook to create a tomb chest of stone for Margaret according to a pattern already drawn up with a grate of marble around it. And just to be clear, in case anyone is confused, the chest-like structure is just for show. The body is in a vault beneath the floor level. It was to be at a height and breadth yet to be determined by the executors and decorated with whatever escutcheons and coats of arms for decor they required. There were also to be gilded copper borders around the tomb with an inscription as yet to be determined, and the whole thing was to be professionally polished. The materials were to be sourced by the sculptor, and the length of the final tomb was to be 7 feet 8 inches and 3 feet 8 inches wide. If necessary, the pattern for the tomb could also be amended at any time by the executors, who were to be able to oversee the work as it went on. Now, Torrigiano was the sculptor, but not the designer, and in fact, the prior of St. Bartholomew's was acknowledged as someone who advised on what the tomb should look like, with the help of a Dutch painter called Maynard Verwyck, and the prior managed the workmen putting it together and even sent for more from beyond the sea. The tabernacle, image, beast, tomb or case and other the premises were to be completed and installed in the Abbey by the 1st of February 1512, and Torrigiano's fee was £400. To put that into context, the Bank of England's converter puts that at about £381,525 in today's money. A large number of documents, including work orders and receipts in the Royal Archives, trace the building and completion of this tomb. These start even before Torrigiano was engaged to build it, with a note in the accounts for £40 paid to the Prior of St. Bartholomew's, the 1st day of August, this is 1511, for my lady's tomb in Westminster. There are too many to list them all, but some of the others included 13 shillings and 4 pence paid on the 27th of December 1511 to M. Garter, the King of Heralds, for making and declaring my lady's arms in 8 escutcheons for my lady's tomb and delivered to the Florentine, which is surely a reference to Torrigiano. Then there were 20 shillings on the same day paid to Desiderius Erasmus for writing an inscription to be engraved on the tomb. More on that shortly. Although the main structure had to be in place in early 1512, it took far longer to create and install all the decorations on it which were required, and payments stretched well into the 1510s. The aforementioned painter, Maynard, for instance, was paid £4 13 shillings 4 pence on the 16th of March 1514 for making of divers patterns for my lady's tomb. Even when all this was done, however, the tomb as we know it today wasn't quite finished. In December 1526, a contract was signed for a Bilbao iron grill. Bilbao is a town in Spain, by the way, which was commissioned from the English smith Cornelius Simonson to be set up around the tomb and decorated with portcullises, roses, escutcheons and crests. This was presumably to help to protect it from onlookers, and it was to be in place by Easter 1528, with Cornelius to be paid £25 in instalments as the work progressed. Payments continued until 1529, however, indicating that the work ended up running behind schedule. At last, 20 years after Margaret's death, her tomb was complete, with the final measurements coming in at 2.3 metres long, 1.2 metres wide, and 1.55 metres high. We have an excellent description of the final product from Edward Brayley and John Neal. It was published in 1818 and says that it is raised on a step and is principally composed of black marble. On each side, between ornamental pilasters, are 3 compartments formed by wreaths of flowers boldly sculpted and enclosing armorial shields of gilt copper crowned. The Abbey's website says these are actually bronze, by the way. Flowers also occupy the spandrels. At each end of the tomb is a similar compartment. On the slab is a recumbent figure of the deceased, with her hands uplifted as in prayer. Her head lies on 2 small cushions surrounded by a perforated canopy. At her feet is a hind couchant. This is actually a Yale, however, as we've already heard. The features are petite, but so strongly characterized by the wrinkles of age and other marks that there cannot be a doubt of their verisimilitude, meaning their authenticity, and the hands are equally true to nature. She wears a kind of hood drawn to a point over her forehead and falling on her shoulders. It's a classic English gable hood of the early Tudor period. A short barb covers her neck. The foldings of her mantle are arranged with graceful simplicity. The whole figure conveys the idea of its having been modelled from real casts of the original, meaning Margaret's body. It is entirely of copper, again other sources say bronze, and has been richly gilt. But the gilding is now only partially visible. It's interesting that this gilt was evidently very well worn away even in 1818. On each side, lying loose on the tomb, is a slender pillar pierced with arches, etc., in the pointed style. These also, as well as the canopy which they appear to support, are of gilt copper. Round the verge is the following inscription, which was composed by the learned Erasmus, and for which, as it is entered in an ancient computus or accounting book belonging to St. John's College, he had a reward of 20 shillings. The original is in Latin, so I'm going to give you a translation here. Margaret of Richmond, mother of Henry VII, grandmother of Henry VIII, who gave a salary to 3 monks of this convent and founded a grammar school at Wimborne, and to a preacher throughout England and to 2 interpreters of Scripture, one at Oxford, the other at Cambridge, where she likewise founded 2 colleges, one to Christ and the other to St. John, his disciple. Died AD 1509, 3rd calends of July, meaning the 29th of June. Her epitaph is fascinating to me as, unlike what you see on the tombs of many aristocratic women of Margaret's era, it doesn't tell you who her father or any of her 3 husbands were, instead just mentioning her son and grandson, who were much higher ranked, and focusing on Margaret's own achievements rather than just her bloodline. The appearance of the tomb has changed a couple of times since the late 1520s. According to Westminster Abbey's website, the grille made by Cornelius Simonson, which was once elaborately painted and decorated with coats of arms and other ornaments, was taken down along with several others in the Abbey and sold by James Wyatt on behalf of the Dean and Chapter in 1823. It was rediscovered and purchased in 1914 by the National Art Collections Fund and presented to the Abbey and replaced around the tomb. This explains why there is no grille to be seen in photographs of the tomb taken before World War I, and yet it is there again today. Nowadays, one must squeeze past the huge memorials to Margaret Douglas, Countess of Lennox, and Mary Queen of Scots in order to get to Lady Margaret Beaufort's tomb, which is actually the smallest and simplest of the 3, despite all the money spent on it. However, for many decades after she was interred, the Dowager Countess of Richmond and Derby was the only person of great note in this part of the Henry VII chapel, and her tomb would have been the centrepiece of the whole room, and instantly drawn the eye when one walked in. None of the Stuarts were there yet, though she now lies within just a few feet of literally scores of them, with the likes of Charles II, William III, Mary II, and Queen Anne buried in a vault at the foot of her own. Make no mistake about it though, initially Margaret was meant to be the centre of attention in that part of the chapel. So we've established what the tomb looks like, but what is the symbolism in its design and decoration? For it is intended to communicate a great deal of information to the viewer, much of which is lost on a modern audience. Let's start with the effigy, which is the most striking part of the whole thing in my opinion. It shows Margaret in old age and wearing widow's weeds in a subtle nod to her position as a thrice-widowed woman, whose last husband, Thomas Stanley, Earl of Derby, had died in 1504. In fact, the effigy looks very much like one of the surviving paintings we have of her, and though her clothing suggests wealth and status, she is not draped in the kind of ornate jewellery that we might expect to see on a woman of her rank. It's all quite restrained. As you've heard, the image looks so lifelike that Edward Brayley and John Neal speculated that the figure seemed to have been made from casts of the original. This idea is supported by the Abbey's own website, which states that the effigy was made using a wax cast technique where a secondary mould is made from a wax cast, allowing intricate work to be done. Her face was probably modelled on a death mask. Her hands are clasped together in prayer to remind us of her devotion to God and the Catholic Church, and her head rests on 2 pillows. These suggest her wealth. Pillows were luxury items in the 1500s, but more obviously they also demonstrate her family background, for they are decorated with portcullises and Tudor roses. The portcullis is a badge of the Beaufort family, into which Margaret was born, and it is widely used today, with a crown surmounting it, to represent the UK Parliament. The famous Tudor rose, meanwhile, is a combination of her family's Lancastrian red rose and the white rose of the family of York. This symbol was created after the union of those 2 branches of the Plantagenets, effected by the marriage of her son with Princess Elizabeth of York in 1486, and I find it interesting that it is included on Margaret's tomb, as she was not part of or descended from that union, and arguably should just have had the Lancastrian rose. As you've heard, these motifs are also replicated in many other places on the tomb too, though, indicating their importance, and I believe they are there to emphasise her connection to the new dynasty and its descent from her, and therefore from Edward III, who was her direct ancestor. The yale on which Margaret's feet rest was her heraldic badge, and features on her coat of arms. It should have a swivelled horn, but unfortunately that has broken off at some point across the centuries, and was already gone by 1818, as I looked at an image of the tomb published in that year, which showed it as being missing even then. There are also a number of shields around the edge of the tomb, which highlight Margaret's family connections, helping to emphasise the entire Tudor family's genealogy, at least the bits of it Henry VIII wanted to remember, and by extension their right to the throne. At the head of the tomb we find the arms of her first husband and father of her son, Edmund Tudor. These impale her own and are surmounted by an unarched crown. On the south side are the shields for Henry VII and Elizabeth of York with an arched crown, denoting the fact that they were a king and queen, Henry V and Catherine of Valois with an arched crown. This is a nod to the fact that Catherine of Valois was Margaret's mother-in-law through Edmund, though funnily enough her base-born second husband Owen Tudor is not represented, and another which I have variously seen called the Shield of Arthur Plantagenet, not Tudor, Prince of Wales, crown unarched, or else the Royal Arms, which seems more likely. On the north side of the tomb is a gap where a shield once sat, which is now gone, though an arched crown remains. There is also a shield representing Margaret's parents, John Duke of Somerset and Margaret Beauchamp or Beauchamp, whichever you prefer, with an unarched crown. The final shield is either for her paternal grandparents, John Beaufort and Margaret Holland, with no crown at all, or for Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, though if that's the case, it's strange that it has no crown. Again, I read different accounts of this. At the foot of the tomb is a shield with the arms of Margaret's third husband, Thomas Stanley, impaling her own Beaufort arms, and again with no crown. Interestingly, her second husband, Sir Henry Stafford, is not represented at all. Perhaps there was simply no more space for his shield. He can't have been the missing one, as it has a crown over it. And as he was not the father of her child, or her most recent spouse, or a spouse whose title she still carried, for she was the Countess of both Richmond and Derby, thanks to her 2 other husbands, remember, he was deemed unimportant enough to be ignored in the shields. He does get a look in on the effigy plate, however, which shows both the Beaufort portcullis and the knot of the Stafford family, so I suppose that's something. Incidentally, if all this talk of family shields and heraldry has you interested in your own background and you have Irish ancestry, you might want to check out my book, Find Your Irish Ancestors Online, which is available from Amazon and which I'll link below for you. In terms of inspiration, the tomb was clearly modelled after that created for Mary of Burgundy, who had died in 1482, was buried in the Church of Our Lady in Bruges, now in Belgium, and whose tomb, which I think is even more ornate than Margaret's, was completed in 1501. Both are in the style of a tomb chest, with an effigy of the deceased woman in copper or bronze gilt on a black marble base. Both are laid out in full length, hands clasped in prayer and with their heads on a pillow or pillows. Just like Margaret's tomb, the sides of Mary's are also covered in coats of arms representing her and her lineage, and there is of course also an inscription. Mary is shown in more ornate clothing and jewellery, including a crown on her head, and there are no railings around her tomb, but the similarities are nevertheless striking, and we might see this as Henry VIII's way of ensuring that England kept up with the artistic achievements of mainland Europe, and that his family were as spectacularly remembered as his rival royals. You might also see similarities between Margaret's tomb and that of her son and daughter-in-law, as Pietro Torrigiano created them both. So Margaret's tomb, for those who know what they're looking at, is a visual and scripted representation of her life, from her birth family to her 3 husbands, her prestigious mother-in-law, her son and grandson, her good works, and her religious life. It tells us everything. I hope you enjoyed that deep dive into its design, construction, history, and symbolism. Let me know below what your favourite part of it is. Is it the effigy, for instance, the story told by the shields, the inscription, or something else? For more on Margaret, watch my 2-part biography of her, or to learn about the death and burial of her grandson, Prince Arthur Tudor, who predeceased her in 1502, see my episode all about his demise. Whatever you choose, please enjoy, and until next time, keep learning.